What happens when a regime spends months quietly rebuilding the one thing it believes can never be seen from above, only to discover that the eyes watching never blinked? Because that is exactly the position Iran finds itself in right now, deep underground, far from public view. Reconstruction work has reportedly been happening for months without public awareness. And according to newly analyzed satellite imagery, almost none of it went unnoticed. Before we go any further, if you actually want to understand what's happening in the world instead of just watching headlines fly past, hit subscribe right now to stay informed. This channel breaks down real strategy behind the biggest global power moves. And this one might be one of the clearest examples yet of how difficult it has become to hide anything from modern surveillance. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something important. Most people watching the news tonight are going to completely miss this. For decades, underground facilities represented one of the most reliable ways for a country to shield sensitive military and nuclear infrastructure from outside observation. The logic was simple, and for a long time largely sound. If something is buried deep enough under solid rock and protected by layers of reinforced concrete and positioned far from any obvious surface indicators, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for an adversary to locate precisely, verify accurately, or strike effectively. Even with advanced weapons technology available, Iran has built much of its nuclear and missile infrastructure around exactly this principle over many years, positioning key facilities deep inside mountains and underground complexes specifically designed to survive aerial and missile strikes that have targeted the program in recent years with growing intensity. That strategy depended on a very specific assumption about concealment, that what happens beneath the surface, away from prying eyes, stays hidden from outside observation and monitoring systems. Reconstruction work and repair efforts inside damaged underground facilities could happen quietly. Movement of equipment and materials underground could, in theory, remain largely out of view from external surveillance, protected by the same geography that shields the facilities during actual strikes. For years, that assumption held up reasonably well without major exposure. Today, it is being tested in a way that reveals something critical. How much observation technology has quietly outpaced the technology of concealment? To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what modern satellite surveillance is actually capable of, because it goes well beyond simply photographing a mountain from above and looking for obvious new construction. Even when the actual underground work itself remains invisible to any camera, the surface activity required to support that work almost never stays fully hidden. Vehicle traffic patterns around a facility begin to change in noticeable ways. Equipment staging areas start to appear where they simply did not exist before. Ventilation and cooling infrastructure needed. For underground facilities, handling sensitive equipment requires surface access points that are difficult to fully camouflage or hide. Soil disturbance from excavation and debris. Removal leaves visible signatures on the surface that can be detected. Later, specialized imaging analysis can identify these patterns even months after the fact. If you are starting to see how surface activity betrays underground operations, make sure you are subscribed now, because we are only just getting into the real mechanics behind this kind of advanced surveillance capability. And the next part explains exactly what kind of technology makes this level of detection possible today. Let us talk about the specific surveillance technology reportedly involved here, because understanding the tools themselves tells you a great deal about why hiding this kind of work has become so much harder. Now modern commercial and government satellite systems now operate across multiple imaging types, simultaneously for deeper detection capability. Each one is designed to catch a different category of activity that traditional photographs would completely miss. Standard optical imaging is what most people picture when they think of satellite photos taken from orbit. It captures visible light like an ordinary camera, but from space with extremely high modern resolution, fine enough to distinguish individual vehicles, equipment pallets, and even personnel movement patterns around a sensitive facility. But optical imaging alone has one very obvious and important limitation. It only works during daylight hours, under clear weather conditions without obstruction, and it can be defeated relatively easily through camouflage, netting, and concealment. Timed activity scheduling can also reduce visibility during known satellite pass windows, along with deliberate concealment of equipment. Anything moved during daylight satellite passes can be hidden with careful planning. This creates gaps in optical surveillance. This is where synthetic aperture radar becomes incredibly significant in surveillance. Unlike optical imaging, radar works differently. Radar-based satellite systems can penetrate cloud cover completely without any issue and operate just as effectively at night as they do during the daytime, which removes a key traditional method of avoiding detection entirely. Simply timing sensitive activity for bad weather or operating after dark no longer guarantees concealment. Radar imaging can also detect extremely subtle changes in ground surface elevation, sometimes measured in just millimeters, which makes it remarkably effective at identifying soil disturbance and surface shifts linked to underground excavation work. Even when no obvious surface changes are visible to the naked eye or to standard optical camera systems, thermal imaging adds yet another analytical layer detecting heat signatures instead of visible light or radar reflections. Underground construction and reconstruction work typically generates detectable heat from machinery operation and continuous use of heavy equipment ventilation systems. Managing temperature and air quality inside sealed underground spaces also produce measurable thermal output signatures. Even the curing process of fresh concrete releases heat during chemical hardening, which becomes visible in thermal imaging. That thermal signature can persist and remain detectable for a meaningful period after physical work has been completed, providing yet another data point that becomes extremely difficult to fully suppress through conventional camouflage techniques alone. When intelligence analysts combine all three of these imaging methods together, carefully cross-referencing data across different sources, changes detected across optical radar and thermal data over extended periods of weeks or even months build patterns. The resulting picture becomes extraordinarily difficult to fully conceal, even for countries with expertise in camouflage techniques. This is precisely the combination reportedly used to track reconstruction activity here and understand patterns from early stages. It explains why what Iran likely assumed would remain a quiet rebuilding effort became visible to outside analysts quickly. It is worth understanding how this multi-spectrum analysis becomes actionable intelligence, because raw satellite imagery alone does not tell a complete story until carefully cross-referenced and interpreted by trained intelligence analysts over time. A single radar pass showing subtle ground disturbance means very little alone and can suggest many different explanations. It could reflect erosion or unrelated agricultural activity or other ordinary changes with no military connection at all. Only when layered with thermal signatures and changes in vehicle traffic patterns detected through optical imaging systems, along with historical baseline comparisons of normal activity at that location before any strikes occurred, does a genuinely confident intelligence assessment finally become possible and reliable? This is precisely why intelligence assessments of this kind typically take weeks or months to develop real confidence. Even when underlying satellite data itself is collected continuously in near real time, analysts must still verify every detail. They have to build a pattern of evidence strong enough to rule out alternative innocent explanations first, before publishing or acting on conclusions. As significant as active reconstruction activity at a sensitive underground facility, that careful and highly methodical process is also why, by the time such stories reach public reporting, the underlying intelligence has already been tracked and refined internally for a considerable period beforehand, meaning decision makers likely had access to preliminary versions of this picture. Well before it became public knowledge, there's also a broader historical pattern worth understanding. In this context, one that stretches back decades, efforts to conceal sensitive military infrastructure from outside observation have a long history, and so do detection efforts. During earlier eras of military history, this contest played out through aerial reconnaissance, photography, and human intelligence. Networks and detailed analysis of supply chain movements that could reveal hidden facilities indirectly without direct observation. Each new generation of surveillance technology has consistently narrowed the gap between concealment and external detection capabilities, between what a country believes it can successfully hide and what observers can actually detect in reality. And this specific case represents simply the latest chapter in that long technological and strategic contest. If this kind of layered analysis is exactly what you come here for, tap the like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people tired of shallow headlines and wanting deeper strategic understanding. Let us talk about why this reconstruction effort matters so much strategically beyond simply the fact it was detected. To understand that, you must go back to the internal power structure shaping major decisions in Iran. The Islamic Republic is not a single unified government making calm and rational choices from one office. It is a fragile three-way balancing act between groups that depend on each other but lack trust. At the top sits the clerical leadership claiming ultimate religious and political authority over the system. Beneath them operates the Revolutionary Guard, the military and economic powerhouse, controlling much of national security, including missile programs and large sections of the domestic economy and infrastructure with deep influence across institutions. And beneath both are the Iranian people, tens of millions of citizens absorbing the daily cost of policies, a government that has spent decades prioritizing military spending and proxy wars over basic economic well-being of citizens, Rebuilding damaged underground infrastructure carries enormous symbolic weight inside this balance beyond its direct military capability. For the Revolutionary Guard, visible reconstruction or quietly confirmed rebuilding progress serves as proof of resilience internally, that previous strikes failed to permanently cripple the regime, core capabilities, and strategic military infrastructure. It becomes a demonstration of continuity and strength at a critical moment of internal pressure and instability. Years of sanctions, economic strain, and battlefield losses have increased pressure on the regime internal cohesion. That internal political value may matter just as much as the facility actual restored military function. This creates a genuinely difficult strategic dilemma for Iran leadership once reconstruction activity gets detected and publicized widely. Rather than remaining quietly confirmed only to internal audiences, it becomes visible to external observers and analysts. A regime that built domestic legitimacy around rebuilding what was destroyed now faces an uncomfortable new reality. The activity meant to project resilience has instead become public evidence of continued vulnerability and exposure. Every new satellite image released publicly, and each independent analysis confirming timelines chips away at the intended narrative. Now let us talk about what this reconstruction is believed to involve because the specifics matter significantly. Reports based on satellite analysis suggest work focused on repairing structural damage to tunnel entrances and internal systems, restoring ventilation and power infrastructure, necessary for the facility to function again after previous damage occurred, and in some cases expanding excavation beyond the facility, previous footprint, adding new chambers or access points. That last detail, if accurate, is particularly significant for strategic assessment because it suggests more than repair. Expanding a facility footprint during reconstruction rather than restoring its previous state indicates a deliberate strategic decision to build additional redundancy and capacity into the site based on lessons learned from earlier strike damage. Engineers rebuilding damaged infrastructure typically incorporate this learned redesign approach to strengthen future resilience significantly, reinforcing structural weaknesses that previous attacks successfully exploited during earlier strike operations to prevent similar damage in future. This pattern is common across military engineering programs facing repeated threats and is not unique to Iran. Let us talk about the timeline of this reconstruction effort because its pace tells a deeper story about the resources and priority Iran leadership has assigned to this specific reconstruction project. Overall, according to satellite analysis, timeline, initial debris clearance, and stabilization work began within weeks of damage, well before any public confirmation or acknowledgement from Iranian officials about the incident or reconstruction. That early start strongly suggests the decision to rebuild was made almost immediately after damage occurred, treated as an urgent priority rather than something delayed among competing economic and reconstruction demands. The subsequent pace of visible activity tracked through changing patterns across multiple satellite passes over months suggests a sustained and well-resourced effort rather than sporadic or underfunded reconstruction activity. Consistent equipment staging areas remained visible across multiple observation cycles, indicating organized and continuous work. Regular vehicle traffic patterns were observed moving in and out of the reconstruction site consistently. Steady thermal signatures aligned with ongoing construction operations further confirm continuous activity at the facility. All of this points toward a program receiving priority access to labor materials and engineering expertise. Even during a period when Iran economy has struggled under sanctions and wartime disruption pressures, there is also a labor and logistics dimension worth understanding here, because complexity increases requirements significantly. Rebuilding hardened underground facilities of this scale requires more than basic workers and construction materials. Specialized engineering expertise capable of handling reinforced concrete blast-resistant structures is not widely available. Sourcing that expertise along with specialized excavation and reinforcement equipment likely required careful national coordination across multiple parts of Iran, domestic defense, industrial base, and possibly support from external partners, including those willing to provide components or technical support not easily produced within Iran itself. That coordination requirement itself creates additional surface signatures. Analysts can potentially track beyond just the physical construction site. Changes in domestic supply chain, activity shipments of specialized construction materials moving toward the facility general region. And even shifts in employment patterns of specialized engineering personnel can provide supporting evidence for analysts. All of this helps support or challenge conclusions drawn from satellite imagery when considered in isolation alone. This is why modern intelligence assessments increasingly rely on multiple independent evidence sources rather than just one, because conclusions supported by satellite imagery, supply chain, Analysis and other indicators carry far greater overall confidence than any single data source could ever provide on its own reliably without cross-verification from others. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding what is actually happening here, instead of just the surface-level version commonly presented in headlines and simplified news coverage. Drop a comment and share. Which part of this surprised you most? I genuinely read and consider them, and it helps shape what topics we choose to analyze in future videos on this channel. Now let us talk about how Iran is likely to respond publicly to this kind of exposure, because, like previous moments of pressure, the gap between public statements and private calculations reveals strategy. Watch for officials to deny the reconstruction activity outright publicly or downplay its overall significance. They may frame it as routine maintenance rather than major rebuilding to reduce perceived strategic impact, or argue that the facility was never as damaged as outside assessments originally claimed. Each of these responses serves a slightly different internal political purpose within the system, but all share a common goal: preventing reconstruction from being seen as evidence of reduced strike effectiveness. Pay close attention to how state media frames any acknowledgement that occurs, because framing itself carries important signals. If Iranian officials eventually acknowledge reconstruction while emphasizing resilience and continued capability, that messaging is aimed internally. At the population and security establishment needing reassurance, the regime remains strong, despite years of pressure and setbacks. If instead officials minimize or deny the reconstruction entirely, that suggests a different internal calculation is guiding. That public confirmation could undermine confidence more than it would reinforce it, especially if rebuilding remains incomplete, or acknowledging it publicly could invite renewed scrutiny and potential further strikes that quiet rebuilding was meant to avoid. There is also a deeper irony worth sitting with carefully here about the purpose of concealment. The entire purpose of building critical infrastructure deep underground was to protect it from detection and attack. The fact reconstruction activity at such hardened, concealed facilities has been tracked in such granular detail reveals something, from initial debris clearance through ongoing construction phases. Analysts have observed consistent patterns of visible activity. It highlights the current state of the technological contest between concealment and modern detection capabilities. Globally, even facilities engineered to resist observation can no longer fully hide, supporting surface-level reconstruction activity, regardless of how well the underground structure itself remains visually shielded from direct confirmation by cameras. Now, let us talk about broader strategic implications of this detection capability beyond this single facility in a moment. If reconstruction at one of Iran's most hardened concealed sites can be tracked this precisely, it raises serious questions about how much strategic depth underground facilities truly provide in this era of persistent multispectrum satellite surveillance, constantly monitoring activity across regions with increasing accuracy and frequency. The traditional value of underground hardening was never permanent invisibility from detection, but rather delaying observation and targeting, making detection difficult and slow enough that facilities could operate productively between attacks and verification cycles, allowing time before outside intelligence services could confirm activity and respond with precision targeting or follow up. That value proposition weakens considerably if reconstruction activity becomes reliably trackable in near real time by observers. A facility that takes months to rebuild with every stage visible offers a much narrower secrecy window, compared to a facility whose reconstruction could pass entirely unnoticed until full operational capability is restored. This shift has significant implications, not just for Iran, but for any country relying on underground hardening as a core element of strategic infrastructure, protection, and survivability, planning against external surveillance and targeting, because the same surveillance capabilities used to track this facility can monitor similar sites globally. There is also a commercial dimension to this story worth understanding. Beyond traditional government intelligence control, much of the capability driving detailed near real-time analysis no longer belongs only to intelligence agencies. A rapidly growing commercial satellite imaging industry has emerged over the past decade with advanced capabilities, offering resolution and a revisit frequency that, in many cases, now rival government systems from previous generations. This shift matters enormously for stories like this because it changes who can observe and verify activity. Tracking facility reconstruction no longer depends solely on classified government assessments that the public may never see. Independent researchers, journalists, and open-source intelligence analysts can now access high-resolution satellite imagery, detailed enough to draw credible conclusions about reconstruction and underground activity patterns without relying on official narratives. fundamentally changing who participates in verifying or challenging government claims about facility status and operations. That democratization of surveillance capability carries its own significant strategic implications for governments managing sensitive information control. Governments no longer have the same ability to fully control narratives around a facility true status simply by restricting access to classified intelligence assessments and internal reports as they once reliably could. Because independent analysts using commercially available imagery can now reach similar conclusions without relying on official government data. Sometimes, even publishing findings faster than official government channels choose to confirm or deny sensitive reconstruction activity. This creates a fundamentally different information environment compared to even a decade ago in global intelligence dynamics, where quiet, unconfirmed reconstruction efforts face a much higher risk of independent public exposure over time, regardless of what governments involved in the conflict prefer the public to believe or accept as truth. There is also an important verification and arms control dimension worth understanding in this evolving information environment. Independent third-party confirmation of reconstruction. Activity provides a relatively neutral data point beyond conflicting government narratives, rather than relying purely on statements from Iranian officials or claims from countries conducting original strikes. Commercial satellite imagery providers now offer resolution and frequency, once limited to government intelligence agencies. Only they play an increasingly important role in enabling independent verification processes across global monitoring efforts today, allowing analysts, journalists, and international organizations to assess claims about facility status without relying on involved parties. Now let us talk about what actually happens next in this situation, because several strategic paths exist. There are three broad paths currently available to countries involved directly in this unfolding geopolitical conflict, and each one carries very different levels of risk and long-term strategic implications for all sides. The first path is renewed strikes targeting the reconstruction effort directly, based on a calculation that allowing the facility to return to full operational capability poses too great a risk to tolerate, especially given how clearly its rebuilding progress has now been documented and confirmed through independent satellite analysis. This path treats the detected reconstruction activity as itself sufficient justification for renewed military action, essentially resetting the clock on whatever strategic disruption the original strikes were intended to achieve. Given how closely this rebuilding effort has apparently been monitored throughout its entire timeline, the countries involved would have detailed, real-time information available to support exactly this kind of targeted follow-up action if political leadership decides the reconstruction has reached a point requiring renewed intervention. The second path is sustained monitoring without immediate additional strikes, treating the detected reconstruction as valuable intelligence to inform future strategic planning and verification efforts rather than an immediate trigger for renewed military action. This path assumes that continued detailed surveillance of the facility's progress provides more strategic value in the near term than another round of strikes would, particularly if the reconstruction remains incomplete, or if intelligence assessments suggest the rebuilt facility will remain vulnerable to future action whenever it becomes necessary. This is, in many ways, a more patient strategic posture, betting that the demonstrated ability to track this kind of activity in near real time provides a form of ongoing deterrence on its own without requiring the escalation risk that comes with additional direct strikes. The third path is diplomatic escalation and international pressure built around this reconstruction evidence, using the documented, independently verified, rebuilding effort as leverage in broader negotiations, or as justification for expanded sanctions and international isolation. This path treats the satellite evidence primarily as a diplomatic and political tool rather than a direct military targeting priority, aiming to use clear, hard-to-dispute proof of continued nuclear and military infrastructure development to build broader international consensus around renewed pressure, rather than relying purely on unilateral military action that risks broader escalation. It's worth thinking through what each of these three paths would actually mean for the broader conflict beyond the immediate headlines. Renewed strikes would likely trigger exactly the kind of retaliatory cycle that has defined much of this conflict already, restarting a familiar pattern of damage, rebuilding, detection, and further strikes that has shown little sign of producing a permanent resolution in previous iterations. Sustained monitoring without immediate action represents a more patient, intelligence-driven approach, betting that persistent surveillance capability itself provides meaningful strategic value even without additional kinetic action in the near term. Diplomatic escalation built around this evidence offers the possibility of building broader international consensus and pressure, though it faces the same fundamental challenge that has stalled previous diplomatic efforts throughout this conflict. translating clear technical evidence into genuine behavioral change from a regime that has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to absorb sustained pressure rather than fundamentally altering its strategic priorities. Consider how each path is likely to unfold over a realistic timeline rather than as an abstract category alone. Under renewed strikes, the most likely sequence involves a period of continued, quiet monitoring immediately following the initial reconstruction detection, followed by a strike timed either to coincide with a facility approaching a specific operational milestone, or with broader shifts in the overall conflict's intensity. Analysts watching closely for this path would look for asset repositioning and any unusual military movement in the weeks immediately preceding an actual strike, since operations of this precision typically require meaningful advanced preparation that itself generates detectable indicators. Under sustained monitoring, the coming months likely bring continued largely quiet intelligence collection, punctuated by periodic public disclosures of updated satellite analysis specifically timed to serve broader diplomatic or deterrence purposes, rather than any dramatic single event. This path is, in some respects, the least visible of the three from the outside, precisely because its entire strategic value depends on patient, ongoing observation, rather than any decisive, headline-generating action. Under diplomatic escalation, expect a more gradual sequence involving formal statements from international monitoring bodies, coordinated messaging from allied governments, citing this specific reconstruction evidence, and potentially renewed sanctions, or trade restrictions explicitly justified by reference to the documented rebuilding effort. This path typically unfolds over a longer timeline than either of the other two, since building genuine international consensus around a coordinated response requires diplomatic coordination that inherently moves more slowly than either continued surveillance or a decisive military strike. None of these three paths is guaranteed, and anyone claiming total certainty about exactly which one is unfolding is almost certainly overselling their own confidence in a situation that remains genuinely unpredictable. What we can say is that the detection of this reconstruction effort has meaningfully changed the information environment surrounding this specific facility, removing much of the ambiguity that previously allowed both sides some flexibility in how they characterized the facility's actual operational status. Before we get to how this all wraps up, it's worth talking about the specific signals worth watching in the coming weeks, because these are the tells that will actually indicate which of these three paths is unfolding long before any official announcement confirms it. Watch for any sudden change in satellite monitoring patterns or publicly released imagery analysis, since an acceleration in publicly shared intelligence assessments often precedes policy decisions rather than simply following them. Watch Iranian state media for any shift in how officials characterize the facility's status, since a move from denial toward grudging acknowledgement, or vice versa, often signals an internal recalculation of which framing serves the regime's interests better at a given moment. Watch diplomatic activity at international bodies responsible for nuclear monitoring and verification, since renewed calls for inspection access or formal statements citing this specific reconstruction evidence would suggest the diplomatic pressure path is being actively pursued. And watch troop and asset positioning around the region, since any unusual movement of military assets capable of conducting precision strikes against hardened underground facilities would suggest renewed direct action may be under active consideration rather than simply continued monitoring. There's also a broader technological and historical dimension to this story worth taking seriously, because it's easy to reduce all of this down to a single facility and a single reconstruction timeline, and forget what this detection capability actually represents in a much larger sense. The contest between concealment and detection has been a defining feature of military strategy for as long as organized conflict has existed, and every major advance in surveillance technology throughout history has eventually forced a corresponding adaptation in how adversaries attempt to hide sensitive activity from increasingly capable observers. What's happening here represents a meaningful step in that ongoing technological contest, one where the traditional advantage held by deep underground concealment has been measurably eroded by the combination of persistent, multispectrum satellite coverage and increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques capable of detecting subtle surface signatures that would have gone completely unnoticed even a decade ago. History offers a useful, sobering guide here as well, because technological shifts of this kind rarely resolve as quickly or as decisively as the dramatic framing around them suggests in the moment. Previous eras of military history have seen similar shifts, where an advance in detection technology temporarily gave one side a significant intelligence advantage, only for adversaries to eventually develop new concealment techniques or operational adaptations that partially restored the previous balance. Whether Iran or any other country facing similar surveillance challenges eventually develops effective countermeasures, against exactly this kind of multi-spectrum detection remains a genuinely open question, and it's likely to shape the next phase of this ongoing technological contest for years to come, regardless of how this specific reconstruction story concludes. And there's a harder question sitting underneath the dramatic framing that inevitably accompanies a moment like this. Detecting reconstruction activity is not the same thing as fully understanding a facility's actual restored capability, its true operational timeline, or the strategic intentions behind the specific choices made during the rebuilding process. There's a meaningful difference between knowing that construction activity is occurring and knowing precisely what that construction will ultimately enable once completed. Analysts and policymakers alike have to navigate this genuine uncertainty carefully, resisting the temptation to draw overly confident conclusions from surface-level evidence about a facility whose most sensitive and strategically significant details remain, by design, hidden from direct observation. There isn't a clean, comfortable answer sitting at the bottom of this story. Anyone who tells you there is one is probably leaving something important out. What we can say with real confidence is this. For decades, deep underground concealment represented one of the most reliable tools available to countries seeking to protect sensitive military and nuclear infrastructure from outside observation and attack. That reliability has just been meaningfully tested, and in this specific case, found wanting, as persistent multi-spectrum satellite surveillance proved capable of tracking a reconstruction effort that was almost certainly intended to remain quiet and largely unnoticed until the facility was ready to resume full operational capability. What we do know is this. The specific facility at the center of this story remains only one example of a much broader technological shift, reshaping the balance between concealment and detection across military and intelligence programs worldwide. Whether this particular reconstruction effort ultimately leads to renewed strikes, sustained quiet monitoring, or intensified diplomatic pressure depends on decisions that haven't been made yet by policymakers weighing intelligence assessments most of us will never see in full. But the underlying lesson of this story extends well beyond this single tunnel complex. In an era of persistent, increasingly sophisticated satellite surveillance, the assumption that anything built deep enough underground can remain genuinely hidden from outside observation is looking less reliable with every passing year, and every government relying on exactly that assumption to protect its most sensitive infrastructure is now facing the same uncomfortable reassessment that Iran's leadership is quietly working through right now. If this video helped you actually understand what's happening in the world right now instead of just watching it scroll past you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs the full picture instead of the 30-second version, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go even deeper into the stories actually shaping our future.